There's a reason that Sifu's museum level is so memorable. You may think it's because of its unique level design or how difficult the boss Kuroki is, but one thing I feel gets overlooked are all of the actual individual art pieces throughout the level. I've not really seen other videos talking about this, so I've decided to break all of the art pieces down and talk about how they support the game's themes. I counted all of the paintings, sculptures, and art exhibits to shine a light on the incredible talent at Slowclap, and the work they put into crafting this absolute gem of a level. As a bonus, I'm also going to be challenging myself as an illustrator to recreate some of these paintings in Photoshop and kind of revealing some of the tips and tricks the artists use to achieve these effects. Anyway, let's get straight into it. If you live in New York or Paris, then the opening section of the museum may feel somewhat familiar to you. That's on purpose, as the team at Slowclap referenced the Guggenheim and the Bourse de Commerce for the creation of the Atrium, which is the first thing we see in this level. Both the real-life museums and the one in-game use a lot of circular motifs that flow upwards and around the floors. In the Guggenheim's case, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright wanted the circles to symbolize infinity and acted as a way to enhance people's experience of the artwork within. However, in Sifu, the circles represent cycles, and this is a major theme of the boss Kuroki. Now, before I actually start nerding out and analyzing all of the different art pieces in the level, we first need to discuss Kuroki and her backstory. Throughout the level, we learn a bunch of things about Kuroki and how she's a Japanese immigrant, unlike the other bosses who are natives of China. Almost all the artworks in the level were created by her, and we can feel through them that she is dealing with some kind of grief. Toward the end, we realize Kuroki had a twin sister that she ended up killing in a duel, and one that she did not wish to be part of. It's also implied that her father was the one to force this duel from his face being scratched out in this family portrait. But in addition to that, a major theme of the museum is water, and much like the famous Bruce Lee quote, "Water can flow, or it can crash." The reason I'm giving you all of this information now is because I want you to have this in the back of your head as we start examining all of the art pieces. So, the entire level can be broken down into 4 floors: Identity, Cycles, Twins, and Rebirth. We begin in the Atrium, which greets us with 3 paintings in its lower corner and a painting of some clouds in the middle. Now, as I mentioned in my Sifu art analysis, each level is based on a different element, and the one chosen for the museum is water. It's clear that Kuroki herself finds water to be cleansing and have healing properties, and if we spare her during the boss fight, we also gain the water talisman. Of course, these paintings right at the front really could have been anything, but they are instead ripples and a flow of lines to reinforce that theme. A lot of the art direction in Sifu is quite graphic, and a fast way to do this in Photoshop is simply just choosing a hard brush with some pen pressure for size. It's important here that your opacity is switched off by checking this menu, and these paintings are just simply a background color and a darker line for lines that flow like this. As we walk into the first exhibition called Identity, we're greeted with this light projection here. This is a forced perspective trick that occurs multiple times in the level, and I think it's meant to symbolize viewing things from the right perspective, but also how things are not as they appear on first glance. As we walk into the exhibition room, we are introduced to a painting of an eyeball, but also several sculptures including colorful fish, a statue, water drops, a broken pill, and also what appears to be a generator of some kind. Something interesting is that the middle statue is one of the few times where an artist other than the boss Kuroki is credited for a work. This piece is called Morning Whirlwind and was made by a French artist named Loquin. The text at the front reads that these art pieces are tinged with anxiety, sadness, and pure absurdity, and they all have to do with different facets of identity. Just like water, our identity can shift and is never static, which is why these art pieces here have so much movement. For example, the droplets show the changing of states. The pill shows 2 halves meeting together with its contents spilling out, and even the generator signals 2 switches for 2 different modes. I feel like the number 2 is significant because it represents Kuroki and her twin, which manifests as a split personality during her boss fight. A little later on, we come across a dark room with a projector of some flowy patterns moving across the screen. After clearing this area, we see the second half of this exhibit, which shows us a couple of abstract paintings, 3 portraits, a bunch of small dolls, and a giant bow tie. All of the portraits here have paint splashed across their faces, hiding their identity behind single blocks of color. Now, the reading that I get from these paintings here is that art can be some kind of form to hide your identity, and you don't actually have to express it. So a cool way to do this in Photoshop is by using some emboss techniques like this. Number 1 is use a painterly brush and lay some strokes down. The second step is to click here at the FX tab at the bottom and then choose Bevel and Emboss. You can play around with some of these settings, but I prefer Inner Bevel and Chisel Hard. Now, when you add new colors, make them separate layers so it looks like the paint has actually been stacked on top of each other. The giant bow also foreshadows this painting we see of Kuroki on level 4. The way that it's positioned almost reminds me of a giant scale. On the quest of revenge, there are two paths that we can take, one full of violence and another of peace. So in a way, it also kind of shows like it's tipping the scales in one favor over the other. As we exit, we see another sculpture near the staircase, which kind of looks like a giant sift, and I suppose keeping in the theme of water, we also see some kind of liquid being sifted underneath it. Maybe this is some kind of commentary about sifting through your identity and kind of like distilling and finding the good stuff. So, in summary, level 1 had 9 paintings and 7 sculptures. As we continue moving up this flight of stairs, we then transition into level 2, which is called Cycle. The theme for this exhibition is how the creative process is a loop, which begins from inspiration to creating the work and then finally the interpretation from the viewer. But also like a loop, we have this outside section before entering the exhibit. We can see a mask stuck behind a glass case, but also a couple of paintings outside the game's boundaries. Normally we can't actually access these during the level, however, we can use the game's replay editor to get ourselves a little closer. One of these paintings here shows a wave that's painted both in red and blue, which also foreshadows the ending sections of the level. The other painting has a bunch of noise in abstract shapes. This may seem like a lot of work to paint since there's so much detail, but there is a pretty easy way to build it up in Photoshop. The first thing I'm going to do is create this background color here, so in this case, white, black, yellow, and a tiny bit of gray. And I'm also using this brick brush here to give me a little bit extra detail and texture. The next step I'm going to do is on a new layer, draw a bunch of lines across horizontally, and really try to vary the space and width between them. You don't have to draw everything here, but you can use this section to copy and paste what you have, and this is going to save you a lot of time in the long run. Now for the horizontal sections, it's pretty much the exact same process. Draw a bunch first, copy and paste, and then continue using those shapes to populate the canvas. And voila, you have an abstract painting. As we step into the first section of Cycles, we are left with this room with 4 intricately stained glass shapes and a sculpture of a vortex moving up. The in-game text says that this is the work of artist collective Strike, which is also kind of funny since we're playing a beat-em-up game. As far as I know, there's an actual artist collective named Strike, but I don't think Slowclap refers to any real-world artists in this level. Let me ask you, what do you think the acronym stands for? It's also said that all of the crystal drops in this area were carefully manufactured with a unique mixture of natural dye. It also looks to me like this is also some kind of interactable exhibit for the public too. There's a couple of sheets of paper and a little workstation, so I imagine this is the one that you can sit down and contribute to, which is kind of neat. Though something funny I do want to point out is all of these finished paintings here are actually the same images used in the Identity exhibit. This is Slowclap probably just reusing textures, but it's kind of funny thinking in-universe that somebody copied an abstract painting they saw perfectly. To cap off the theme of Cycle, the end of the room has the sculpture of a tap with a spout of color being put back into a glass jar. This is meant to symbolize the cyclical nature of color and inspiration. The second half of this exhibit is probably one of the most memorable rooms in this entire level, and it's because of how its visual look ties in with the gameplay. A giant kunai remains suspended from the ceiling and continues drawing black dye across the floor in a circle. I remember seeing something like this in real life once, where it was basically just a pen suspended on a string, and there was a sheet of paper on the bottom. The actual exhibition was outside, and so the whole point of it was for the wind to naturally carry the pen in different directions, and you would kind of see what it drew. Now, it didn't actually end up looking like anything apart from just a bunch of scribbles, but it was still pretty cool. The kunai will continue moving perfectly in a circle until we interrupt it. It's also going to slam into enemies, but also us if we're not careful. Now, my first thought here goes to how we interrupt the cycle of violence, but also how it can damage us if we get caught in it. The walls of the exhibit showcase black waves, which later show up in Kuroki's second phase. As I mentioned in my Sifu analysis, these waves are reminiscent of the Great Waves of Kanagawa, which ties in with her Japanese heritage. Behind the giant kunai is another painting, which shows a figure moving in what seems like a death and rebirth cycle. Once we step outside, we also see one more painting in this level, which has a bunch of abstracted circles flowing around. This one is actually pretty fun because it's so easy to recreate in Photoshop. All you need to do here is select the default round brush and bring up F5 for the brush menu. Go straight to spacing here in Shape Dynamics and drag it just a little bit so you can start to see the individual circles break apart. Now, go to Color Dynamics and move all of these sliders up high to get maximum variation on our colors. All that's left to do is simply just choose a color and in one continuous stroke, draw all over your canvas. It's really that simple. We also see installations of various pieces of colored paper moving up or down, which kind of look like confetti. So, to recap, level 2 has 4 paintings, 2 big installations, and 3 sculptures. The third floor, called Twins, has the most amount of art pieces in it by far. Before we move on to this level, we are greeted with an abstract painting of bubbles underwater. As this floor is called Twins, this floor deals with how art is copied and referenced, and how the artworks in this level stem from the same theme and variation. Of course, the twins metaphor is pretty explicit since Kuroki had a twin, but this entire section just kind of hammers down that point even more. But level 3 also has an entirely separate art exhibition that wasn't created by Kuroki, which I'll discuss in just a minute. Just like level 2, there are also a few artworks that are inaccessible to us without the use of the replay editor. These are a painting of a plant, an abstract painting of what appears to be either a Torii Gate or the Golden Gate Bridge, and a sculpture of broken concrete that's painted blue with "Big Wave" written on it. Big wave, dude! As we step inside the Twins exhibit, we are stuck in this main room with 3 sculptures and a whole bunch of paintings. The first golden sculpture here is noteworthy because I'm pretty sure this is supposed to be alluding to the next level with Jinfeng in the tower. In fact, earlier in the level, Jinfeng is also said to have sponsored this entire art exhibition, and everything is kind of linked together. In my Sifu breakdown, I also talked about how gold and square shapes are used to communicate the theme of the tower, and this is exactly what we see here. The second sculpture shows 2 sets of plates that appear to have been repaired by kintsugi by these fused cracks. They all form towards the middle, and then we have 2 sets of bottles right here. The third sculpture is kind of surreal, with gradients of pink and blue bubbles emanating from a buoy. I'm not actually sure how this relates to the concept of twins, but I think it's just another water theme. But in addition to that, there's a striking painting of a night sky in a blood-red field, and also an Andy Warhol-inspired piece of a rock canyon. To achieve an Andy Warhol piece, you're going to need to have your subject on a separate layer, and then come down and click this half-circle icon and choose Threshold. This is going to make everything black and white, and you can adjust the balance using the slider. When you're happy, merge everything together. Now click that same half circle and select Gradient Map. This is going to give everything a separate color. So you can separate the subject from the background too and give it another solid color, and then just copy and paste them over again and again and change the gradient maps to achieve the Andy Warhol effect. We're also going to see this motif used throughout the rest of the room with exactly 30 portraits strewn about. Yes, I did count them. Actually, no, I lied, that wasn't me. My brother counted them. I was too lazy. Something I didn't notice until making this video was these sets of lights above. They have these sheets with a snowflake shape cut out of them, and that leads to these very interesting little light projections on the floor. Once again, this teases the upcoming fight with Kuroki as the first phase takes place in the snow. As we move past this room into the area where we encounter the bodyguard enemy for the first time, we can learn this is actually Kuroki's first installation as the museum's lead curator. It's specified that there are 30,000 black PVC beads suspended above, which I believe symbolize rain. Of course, the twin imagery here is pretty explicit, and just like the room with the giant kunai, this also symbolizes our impending boss fight with Kuroki, as well as the twin mini-bosses. After we exit the section, we also see 3 more sculptures, and these are actually probably my favorite in the entire level. I don't really know why, but they just look really cool. The first sculpture is that of a mannequin with a striking red dress, and it looks like she's trying to break free through some kind of surface. Her face is being cut off as she's looking up, which is actually kind of a grim image. Next to her is another sculpture of a squiggly figure, and I don't really have much to say apart from it just kind of reminding me of the monster in Kane Pixel's Backrooms. The final sculpture here is this separated shark that feels like an homage to Damien Hirst's Myth, Explored, Explained, Exploded, which was a shark suspended in formaldehyde. Hirst made multiple of these, and the artworks themselves were pretty controversial considering real sharks were hunted just for this artwork. It's meant to be a commentary on how we view life and death and viewing things from different angles, so I suppose in the case of Sifu, it's pretty apt. Moving on from that, earlier I also mentioned that level 3 contained a whole exhibition that's completely separate from Kuroki, and it's found right here. The Vestige of a Lost World here is actually an Easter egg and homage to Soclap's first game, Absolver. The collection of Adalian masks here are from Absolver, including this one where you learn the Calbert focus move. The exhibition continues through these doors, but we can't actually access it, unfortunately. It would have been really cool to see what other works there would be in this section. I kind of imagine a foresty section with a bunch of rock structures everywhere. In summary, level 3 contains 36 paintings and 7 sculptures. And finally, we move upwards to the final floor, which is called Rebirth. Before we exit, there are 2 paintings here on the left-hand side, one of some fish and a woman with fiery red hair, and another of a 2-tone graphic illustration of a sculpture. As I showed you earlier with the Andy Warhol example, this is really easy by simply selecting Threshold in Photoshop. You can pretty much do this to any image here, and in this case, they've done one of a Greek sculpture. As we step outside, we see this painting of the Vitruvian Man and a bunch of symbols underneath that start uniform and then break away. I have no idea what these are, but if you recognize it, please let me know in the comments down below. This level also contains Kudoki's atelier, which is where we get this painting of her holding her dead sister. We also see on this photo next to it that her father's face is scratched out, implying she feels some kind of resentment toward him. Now, considering Kudoki feels grief and remorse for killing her sister, it's kind of speculated online that her father forced the duel, and perhaps this is why she fled Japan in the first place. Around the atelier, we can also see how some of the other works were created. Various tools and half-finished sculptures lay around, as well as half-painted works. Some of these are just texture reused from the earlier levels, but we also do get this unique one of these angry faces, which looks kinda cute. To enter the final section, we must step out across the void, where we see this final forced projection of Kudoki herself, and that takes us into this surreal area. This section is my favorite because of how striking the imagery is, as it starts off mostly white and a little bit of blue, but eventually the blue takes over and symbolizes the feeling of being submerged. As we fight throughout the section, we learn more about Kudoki's grief through her 4 stages, which are loss, pain, anger, and rage. Later on in this opening section, we can see the same bow tie that we saw in level 1, and what's cool is that we also see a reflection of Kudoki in the floor. This is something we do see during her boss fight too, and is another way to harken home the theme of duality and reflection. A little later in the level, and we are brought into this extremely striking area where our silhouettes are bathed in red. I feel like this is maybe some kind of personal hell for Kudoki, where it's chaotic and frantic and you can't really see that much. We do finally get to see her duel with her sister through sculpture form, and this gives us the final piece of the puzzle about her backstory. The rest of the stuff here aren't so much individual art pieces as much as just different sculptures, and we continue fighting all the way until we reach the boss arena. It was pretty hard for me to count all of the artworks in level 4 because it does start to get a little blurred, but I'm only going to count 7 paintings. I'm not going to count all of the individual sculptures, so I'm just going to leave it there. So, after all of that, that was a lot of counting, but it really gave me a deeper appreciation for this level. Overall, here are the final stats for the museum. 58 paintings, 2 big installations, 17 sculptures, and a whole bunch of surrealism. When I start to think about the rest of Sifu, I really think about why Kudoki's story was so successful. The reason that it works is because of how much it foreshadows everything before the main boss fight. All of these art pieces could have been anything or just completely random, but time and time again we can see how it supports the game's themes of grief, identity, and water. Kudoki's story kind of acts as a cautionary tale for the player character, and we can see how going down the path of violence is not going to make you feel any better. She's also a character dealing with the death of a loved one, just like Yang, which I actually find pretty poignant. If you're also wanting more analysis on the museum level, I highly recommend this article here written by Eric B. I'm going to leave it in the description down below. This video took quite a bit of time to make, as you can probably imagine, but I really do appreciate you sticking around this far. If you like this kind of content, please let me know and consider subscribing. That's going to be it for today, everyone, and until next time, take care and stay safe.